Hey guys, it's Timothy again. Thanks for joining me for my limited set review of Amonkhet. We're going to be looking at the blue cards this time. If you haven't already checked out the video on the white cards, please do so. And I would appreciate it if you leave your comments about the individual cards. Let me know what you think I'm overvaluing. Let me know what you think I'm selling short. And let's have a conversation about it. One thing I wanted to mention before this video that I didn't mention with the video on the white cards is the aftermath cards. I will cover those completely in a separate video with the multicolor cards, the gold cards. The reason for that is some of them are split cards that have two different colors, and some of them are technically monocolored cards. So there are a couple aftermath cards I could include in this video, but I figured since there's such a weird dynamic to the way they work and to the way they affect your draft and your deck building, I would just cover them all at once and go ahead and get those done all at the same time. So if you don't see certain cards here that are split cards or aftermath cards, that's why. So let's go ahead and jump in. Again, if you want to check out the rating scale, it's right here for you. You can pause the video if you care that much. If not, we're going to go ahead and jump in, starting with our zeros. There is a card, unfortunately, in this set that I would consider unplayable. Even though it looks like it could be quite strong. That card is our blue mythic As Foretold. Now, what this card does is you pay 3 mana, it does nothing right away, and then on each of your upkeeps you get a time counter on it. And then once per turn you can cast a card for free if it has a mana cost that's equal to or less than the number of time counters on it. Now, this sounds like a decent effect, right? Assuming that you get this on turn 3, you can actually start casting free spells, but the type of spells you're going to be casting aren't really relevant once this gets enough counters to actually start casting free spells, right? So assume you get this on turn 3, and that's assuming pretty tough. If you don't get this on turn 3, it's absolutely terrible. Assume you get this on turn 3. On turn 4, it gets a counter, and you have the ability to cast a 1-drop or less. On turn 5, you can cast a 2-drop or less. On turn 6, a 3-drop or less, so on and so forth. By the time this gets up to a high enough number where you'd want to be casting free spells and doing really strong things with this, you already either have enough mana to do that by yourself, or you're probably out of cards. Now, this is blue. Blue has a lot of cycling. Blue has a lot of card draw, especially in this set. So there are ways to fuel your hand to make this useful, but I think it requires so much setup. It asks you to do so much that it's really not worth the trouble, and you shouldn't really go through the pain of trying to make this work. Now, keep in mind, you might not draw this on turn 3. You might draw this late in the game where it's going to be an absolute dud. This is an absolutely terrible top deck to have. It doesn't do anything the turn it comes down, so if you're against a really aggressive deck, this isn't really going to help you. I will admit, I think this is a card you just shouldn't be playing rather than a card that's 100% unplayable, but I don't see myself ever including this in a deck, so I leave it as a 0. Not even going to give it a 2. I'm really not. This happens a lot with blue mythics. If you remember Mind's Dilation from Eldritch Moon, it has a super powerful effect, but just doesn't really cut it in limited. Not really any widens here. Keep in mind, blue's not really known for its sideboard potential, so we're going to go ahead and skip over the 1s and start with our 2s. These are the cards that really don't make a huge impact on the game, starting with Slitherblade, a really weird card for this set. Now, this is blue for a 1/2 unblockable creature. The reason, honestly, when I was putting this video together, I originally had this as a 0, a card you shouldn't play. And honestly, most of the time, you shouldn't be playing this card. There aren't a lot of things that really combo with it. Like, there aren't a lot of auras that really benefit you putting them on an unblockable creature. There aren't a lot of benefits for having an unblockable creature in this set in the first place. The reason I gave this a 2 instead of a 0 is because there are some blue-black or blue-green builds where you're going to have those low-curve creatures that need you to put -1/-1 counters on something, and that's where 1-drops really come in handy. If you play one of those really strong 2-drops that could essentially be a 4/4 or something like that, but you need to put -1/-1 counters on something, it's nice to have a 1-drop laying around to put those counters on, let that die, and get the full potential out of your 2-drop. So, I'm saying Slitherblade has some value as essentially Sackfather, or something that you intend to die later in the game. Otherwise, there are a couple auras that you could attach for the curiosity effect. Whenever it hits, you draw a card or something along those lines. But the card's just so impactful without other cards to go with it that I would not be happy to include this in pretty much any blue deck. The other card is Compelling Argument. This is 2 mana, target player mills 5, and you can also cycle this for a blue. Now, I think the idea here is that you're supposed to mill yourself because blue does have a little bit of Embalm going on. I think blue-white archetype is Embalm. And you can also cycle this for blue. And as I've said many times while looking at Amonkhet, any card that has cycle in is probably a perfectly main deckable card. But if you're playing a card with the sole intention of cycling, you could just play a better cycling card instead of one that doesn't really have a meaningful effect on the game. Also, it's worth mentioning that mill is not really something you should be going for if you're using this on your opponent, so don't really use this for that end. If you need to mill yourself for some reason and you can't find a better way to do it, then you could play this card, but it doesn't really do anything, and I think most of the time you play this card, you would just cycle it away anyways. Now, moving on to the 3, some weaker cards that they could make the main board, but I'm not very happy. This is usually what I include in my deck when my draft is not going very well. The first one is Decision Paralysis. Remember, blue's not going to have hard removal, so you'll see a lot of these weaker removal spells in the 3 and 4 slot. Decision Paralysis is 4 mana for an instant that taps 2 creatures, and they don't untap during their controller's next untap step. Normally, I'm a big fan of this effect, especially if you're some tempo-oriented deck. But there are a couple things to note here. First off, blue is not a very aggressive color. There are a couple creatures that I'll mention throughout the course of this video that are good attackers in blue, but blue's just not very good at it. It is defensive, and this is a defensive card, so you will use it as such. The problem is this card doesn't replace itself or give you any other benefit. We're used to seeing this sort of card in sets, but it usually gives you some extra benefit tacked onto it. Also, this is just clunky at 4 mana. If this costs 3 mana, I'd be a little happier with it. Still not impressed, but just a little bit happier. If you happen to be in a blue-red deck or something along those lines where you're actually an aggressive deck with blue defensive spells, this card goes a little bit up in value. But as is, it's just stalling the game. And if that's what you need to do, then sure, play a Decision Paralysis. But I could never see myself playing 2 of these in the same deck, and I just think it's a little bit on the weaker side. Illusory Rapence looks like a fine spell. It's 3 mana for an enchantment that makes the creature's base power and toughness 0/2. We saw this card in Dragons of Tarkir. I believe the card was called Reduce in Stature, and in all honesty, it wasn't a very good card. It was a card that you would play in your deck and you'd be okay with it, but you're never really happy when you have to put this on an opponent's creature. The creature doesn't lose any abilities. The creature still blocks if able, and oftentimes it'll just die in combat or it'll chump. It gives your opponent a nice little thing to sacrifice if they're in something like the black deck that wants to be sacrificing creatures in the first place. And yes, it does function as removal for a really problematic card, but it doesn't actually get it off the board and doesn't stop it from doing some of the things that it normally does, which is really, really annoying. This, I guess, is decent on Embalm creatures where it stops them from being relevant on the board, but doesn't send them to the graveyard so they can be embalmed. But at some point, it's just going to block and go to the graveyard anyway. Not a big fan of this card. Not very good removal, even though it will do the job if you're running light on ways to deal with your opponent's creatures. The last one is River Serpent. I don't know why in 2017 we're still making serpents with downside. This is just an embarrassing card. 6 mana 5/5 that can't attack unless there are 5 or more cards in your graveyard, and it cycles for blue. Again, cycling does make cards a little bit stronger, but if you have better cycling cards, you should still be playing those over bad cycling cards. If your whole intention is to cycle this, you need to have it for a game plan, right? And if your whole intention is to cycle just this card, just pick up a better cycling card. If you have to play this, then your draft's probably not going very well. This is not this is not the top end card you want in blue. And yes, that stipulation's not that hard to pull off. Having 5 or more cards in your graveyard is not that hard, especially with Cyclone being in the set and a lot of discard as is. But this card just gets trumped by most of the other colors' top end cards. 5/5 for 6 is just not really cutting it in this set, even though it does stabilize the board pretty well if you get it down. It's just not a very good card in general. Alright, moving on to the archetypal filler, you're going to see a lot of cards that care about discard and cycling here. Again, blue has a pretty strong, or a pretty wide array of cards that have Cyclone, since Cyclone is part of the color's identity. Yes, every color has Cyclone, but blue has a good bit more, and there's a lot of payoff for it. So we're going to look at cards like New Perspectives. This is 6 mana for an enchantment. You draw 3 cards, and then if you have 7 or more cards in your hand, you can cycle cards for free. The problem with this card is, first off, it costs 6 mana. You're taking a whole turn off to do this, and it's very unlikely you're going to be able to do anything else. Drawing 3 cards for 6 mana is definitely not a premium rate, right? You usually want to pay 4, maybe 5 mana for that, but 6 at sorcery speed is really not cutting it. And then that clause about being able to cycle cards for free really only matters if you have a reason to be doing that in the first place. If you have some sort of card that pays you off for discarding a bunch of cards in the same turn, then I could see wanting this. But keep in mind, there's a stipulation attached to that. You have to have 7 or more cards in hand. And keep in mind, you're not really casting this until turn 6. So yes, this can refill your hand, which is pretty nice, but it does it at sorcery speed. It does it by taking your entire turn off, and it has a clause that doesn't matter too much unless you have another payoff card for this. So this is more of a combo-oriented card than it is just a standalone card. And yes, if you have the cards that pay you off for cycling and you have a deck that's full of cyclers, then I could see this doing some work. But as is, if I'm just playing this as a card in my deck that doesn't really have any potential with other cards, then I don't think I'd run it at all. Sacred Excavation is very close to the same lines of thought as New Perspectives. It's 4 mana for a sorcery that can return up to 2 cards with Cycling from your graveyard to your hand. I think in the right kind of deck, this is actually just a really good card, since it is a 2-for-1, this kind of raise dead effect for Cycling cards. This can get back creatures with Cycling. This can get back instants and sorceries with Cycling. It can get back anything that has Cycling, whether you cycled it in the first place or whether it just died in combat or something along those lines. So this is a pretty good card to have in the late game. But again, if you just have a deck that only has 4 or 5 cyclers in it, it goes way down in value. It reminds me of a card from Eldritch Moon called Shreds of Sanity, which was a 3-mana red sorcery that could get back 1 instant and 1 sorcery from your graveyard. And occasionally in the decks that had tons of instants and sorceries, it would be just a fantastic card. But in decks that only had a couple here and there, it was a card that you wouldn't run at all. And the same goes here. The more cycling you have, the more excited you are to run this. The less you have, the more likely you are to just keep this in your sideboard. Seeker of Insight, 2 mana for a 1/3 that can tap to draw a card and then discard a card, but only if you've cast a non-creature spell this turn, is a really, really weird card. Normally, looters are going to be good, but looters that require some other condition to be met are just a little bit worse. I don't think this card's actually that strong, since it doesn't really trigger off you cycling. You have to actually be casting your spells. If this could loot whenever you discarded or cycled, that'd be pretty nice, but it doesn't do that. The reason I think this card has a place in certain decks is because there are some decks that are going to be heavy on instants and sorceries, and looting is still pretty good, especially when there are payoffs for discarding cards. Remember that draw a card, discard a card triggers some of these other spells that trigger whenever you discard a card. Most of them say whenever you cycle or discard, which is functionally the same thing. But if you have a deck that wants you to be discarding cards, then Seeker of Insight gets a little bit better. But again, if you only have 3 instants or sorceries in your entire deck, leave this card out of your deck and look for something better. And it does block fairly decently in the early game, so gets a little extra nod for that. Scribe of the Mindful, 2 and a blue for a 2/2 that can sacrifice itself for 1 mana and get an instant or sorcery back from your graveyard to your hand. I had this originally even a little bit lower, but I think this card's just good value. It's not a fairly decent body. It's 3 mana 2/2, which isn't that great, and you're not blocking with this thing anyway, and you're not really putting this in combat unless you have to, which probably means your match isn't going very well. But the fact that you can cycle off a really strong instant or sorcery, draw a new card, and then at some point sacrifice this to get that card back seems pretty sweet. Not to mention, if you just have a good instant or sorcery that you end up casting, yes, sometimes you can cast your cycling cards instead of cycling them, then you could get that back too. And I like this guy as just a little bit of a roadblock for your opponent that also has a little bit of extra value in the late game. Alright, now we're getting into the chunk of blue. Blue has a lot of playables in this set, and a lot of that is because of Cycling. I think most of these Cycling cards go up a notch because of Cycling, even though, like I said, just having a bunch of cyclers in your deck doesn't really get you anywhere. You either need a payoff for that, or you need to have a reason to be cycling constantly. Most of the time, you just want to cast your cards anyway. The first card I wanted to mention is Zenith Seeker, which I might be putting a little bit lower than it should be. It's 4 mana for a 2/2 flyer. Whenever you cycle or discard a card, target creature gains flying until end of turn. The reason I give this a little bit of a lower grade is because in a blue shell, this card's a little bit weaker because a lot of your threats already have flying, which means this card isn't actually doing anything, and you do need to have an effect going. Not to mention, it's a little bit underpowered for a 4-power flyer. I usually look for 3 power or 3 toughness out of my 4 mana flyers, and this one doesn't quite get there. It lacks power and toughness in exchange for a triggered ability, which could come in handy. This card probably goes a little bit up if you're playing something like blue-green or blue-black, where you just have bigger creatures that you can give flying. But if you're not in that sort of shell, if you're just a blue deck, like I said, blue's not a very aggressive color, and blue's shell is going to take less advantage of this ability than you would think. Cartouche of Knowledge is the blue cartouche. It's 2 mana. Enchants a creature you control. You draw a card when it enters the battlefield, and it gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 in flying. Like I just said, most of your threats in blue already have flying, so giving it flying is kind of a dud unless you're putting this on a bigger creature that doesn't have flying, in which case, you know, it's decent. And I like this one just as a playable card because it does replace itself. If all you're getting is +1/+1 and replacing itself, then, you know, it's not an impressive card, but it does its job pretty well. And again, I mentioned this in the white video. If you have the blue trial, which I'll mention here in a little bit, this card goes up a little bit in value. Not a lot, but just a little bit in value. Essence Scatter is one of our generic counter spells, reprint for this set. It's 2 mana to counter any creature spell. I normally wouldn't play situational cards like this. This is essentially the creature version of Negate, but that's a much more main deckable counterspell than Negate is when it comes to limited. Keep in mind, I'm talking mostly about draft here, not sealed. But if you want to play a control game, Essence Scatter is always going to have targets. Yes, it gets a little bit weaker in the late game, but there are always creatures, and limited games have to be won by creatures for the most part. So Essence Scatter is almost always going to get a target, and it's going to do it at a pretty reasonable cost. If you want to play a long game, then I have no problem with main deck and Essence Scatter in this format. Heckma Sentinel is probably a little stronger than it looks. 2 and a blue for a 2/3 that gets +1/+1 whenever you cycle or discard. Again, this is a little bit of a payoff for being a heavy cycling deck, but I really just don't see this being like your win condition or anything like that. I think it's just a solid card, and occasionally it'll do more than 2 damage, but as is, it needs things to actually be happening in order for it to be a good card. Otherwise, it's just a fluff card as is. A 2 mana 2/3. I'm sorry, a 3 mana 2/3 is not an impressive card. Where I do like this is as a blocker. If you have mana up and your opponent knows that you have the potential to be cycling for 1 or 2 mana, potentially more than 1 card at a time, then this could be a really threatening blocker, or attacker for that matter, and that leads me to believe that it's probably just a little bit stronger than it looks, but as is, I'm not willing to give it that grade until I see it in action. Cancel is cancel. I hate the card, but sometimes you play it, especially if you're playing a long game control deck. Worse than Essence Scatter in most cases, but more flexible as far as what it can counter. Double blue is sometimes a problem too, so keep that in mind. Talkrop Skirmisher, 2 mana for a 2/1 that can embalm for 4 mana and come back as a 2/1 zombie Naga warrior. This is, again, a weird card for blue because blue doesn't really want to be attacking that often or that early. It is an aggressive little creature, but has no extra bonuses, and Embalm does give it a little bit of extra value as a creature that is essentially a 2-for-1 throughout the course of the game, which is just how Embalm works. This is the type of creature you play on turn 2, and you're happy to trade with your opponent's red deck's 2-drop or something like that, and then Embalm it again. I think this guy will be blocking more often than it will be attacking, but it's a nice thing to have on turn 2 if you're scrapping for early game plays in a blue deck. And then finally Censor, which is actually a really good counter spell, but still just not an amazing effect. This is the Force Spike effect. You're paying 2 mana to counter a spell unless its controller pays 1, which is an effect that's really, really good in the very early stages of the game, about turns 1 through 5, but then drops off significantly when your opponent just happens to have spare mana floating around. But Cycling is very good on this too. Counterspells with Cycling are a little bit stronger than they look, because sometimes a counterspell like this can really dictate how a game flows. If you manage to counter your opponent's pivotal spell on an early point in the game, then your opponent falls behind and you start to take the lead. Especially if you're playing a control shell, you can start getting your blockers on board without a lot of pressure. Sometimes Censor's just not going to work out, and this type of effect, where your opponent can get out of it by paying mana, is a little bit weaker and limited, because it does make this a bad top deck card, but you can always cycle it away, and the cycling cost is very reasonable. So I like Censor as a card. I don't think it's super powerful, but I think it does deserve mention as a playable card. Alright, moving on to the 6s. Lots of 6s here to talk about. The first one is Trial of Knowledge. The blue Trial is 4 mana. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards and then discard a card, and as with all the trials, it bounces back to your hand whenever a cartouche enters the battlefield. This is close to Compulsive Research, not 100% close since it is 4 mana instead of 3, but it is a sorcery speed way of drawing 3 cards and then discarding 1. And I do like that. 4 mana to draw 3 cards is pretty decent, even if you have to do it on your turn. I like this card even more if you have the blue cartouche, since that one also draws you a card. And this just sets you up to draw a bunch of cards throughout the course of a game. I think that this is very reasonably costed, and is a card that I would include in every single blue deck I play, and would be happy to play it. Maybe multiples, probably not. If I have a cartouche, I'd rather run the cartouche than the second Trial, I think. But I might be wrong about that. Vizier of Tumbling Sands is 3 mana for a 1/3 that can tap to untap any other permanent. You can also cycle it for 1 in a blue, and when you do cycle it, you can untap a permanent a single time. I like this card because it gives blue access to something that blue doesn't normally have, which is mana ramp. Which is probably the primary way you'll use this card. It is a little bit underpowered as a 1/3 for 3 mana, so it's not going to be super relevant in combat all the time, but its real power is in its ability to untap something. Keep in mind, you can use this as a combat trick too. If you cycle this in response to your opponent's attacks, you can untap one of your creatures and really surprise your opponent. That probably requires you to be playing a different color besides blue, since most of your blue cards are a little bit high toughness, low power, and that doesn't really ambush your opponent so much as just block them. But I like this as just a little mana ramper for blue, and also has a couple other neat tricks with Exert and so on and so forth. Floodwaters is a late game payoff card. It's 6 mana for a sorcery that can bounce 2 creatures to their owner's hands, and you can also cycle it for 2. I really like these expensive cycling cards because they give you a reason to think strategically as to whether or not you need a card right away, or if you can wait till the late game to cast the card. Floodwaters is a good card to be casting in the late game, just sending your opponent back 2 creatures, which is an effect I like quite a bit, even if 6 mana for it is a little bit overcosted. Cycling for 2 mana is also reasonable, so this is just good on both sides, and I can see myself wanting a Floodwaters in most of my blue decks. Wings of Rebuke, a card that I honestly will probably value higher than I have it here, but also a card that I want to be reasonable about. I'm just a big fan of 2 mana bounce spells when it comes to limited. Winds of Rebuke is 2 mana to bounce any non-land permanent, not just a creature, and then each player mills 2. So a little bit awkward with that mill clause. Again, if you're white-blue and you have a lot of embalmed creatures, then maybe that's a bonus for you, even though it could be a bonus for your opponent too. But I just like these little tempo cards, especially if you're against aggressive decks. It gives you a way to interact in the early game. It doesn't actually kill the creature or get rid of it so your opponent can replay it, but I just like the cards in general. They give you a little bit of a safety net or a trick that you can use in a really dire situation. Shimmer Scale Drake is 5 mana for a 3/4 flying with cycling for 2. Pretty simple card. We saw Sky Swirl Harrier in Kaladesh, and it was a little bit weaker because of how aggressive that set was. That was just a 3/4 for 5 with no extra abilities. well, flying, obviously. This is the same exact card, but add in the ability to cycle that away for something else makes it just a little bit better. I would say Sky Swirl Harrier ended up being about a 5, and I think cycling pushes that card up to about a 6 without ever being a super busted card or a card that I'm really happy to take very early in the pack. Next card on this list is Gale Strike. 3 mana for an instant, an uncommon that can return a tapped creature to its owner's hand, and then you draw a card. I'm a real big fan of these types of cards in Limited, the type of cards that set your opponent back a creature while not setting you back a card by drawing you an extra card. Cards like Drag Under from Eldritch Moon or Leave in the Dust from Ether Revolt. These tempo-oriented cards that replace themselves, they're usually pretty good. And I have a reason to believe that Gale Strike will be good as well. Keep in mind it only bounces tapped creatures, so there are some times this isn't going to do what you really want it to. Either your opponent's creature has vigilance or they're just not attacking with it and you're not able to bounce it back. So it does have a little bit of a downfall to it, but it shouldn't come up too often, or at least you'll be able to use this the way you want to more often than you won't. Naga Oracle is an interesting card. 4 mana 2/4 that lets you look at the top 3 cards of your library when it enters the battlefield, and you can put them back in any order, or you can put any number of them into the graveyard. So the idea here is that this is another payoff for having embalmed creatures in your deck, where you can pitch those embalmed creatures to the graveyard and set up your next couple of draws. This is also pretty good if you have a lot of lands already and you don't want to draw any more. You can use Naga Oracle to set up your next couple of draws by pitching all of the lands to the graveyard and putting the next couple cards. So it's essentially a 2/4 with Scry 3, although a little bit of a wonky Scry, where you send cards to the graveyard instead of the bottom of the deck, but that can really be a payoff for you, not to mention it's a decent blocker. 2/4 for 4 mana is not an embarrassing card by any means, and I think this card is actually just good. I'd be happy to have at least one in most of my decks. Hieroglyphic Illumination is a card that definitely gets a 6 simply on flexibility. It's the epitome of cycling versus casting a card, right? 4 mana for an instant that draws 2 cards, or you can cycle it for 1 mana. So you have the option to cycle this and just get a natural 1-for-1, replace the card, and draw a new card. Or if you can hold off, you're not under a lot of pressure, you can afford to pay 4 mana on the end step of your opponent's turn or something like that, you get the 2-for-1 that you really want out of the card. A 4 mana draw 2 is a card that comes up quite a bit in Limited, and it's a fine card even though it's not an exciting one, but being able to cycle this gives it enough flexibility that I'd be happy to run this card in my deck. Labyrinth Guardian is interesting, and is a card that looks like you'd probably give it a higher rating, but again, with blue just not being an aggressive color, this card seems a little bit out of place. It's 1 in a blue for a 2/3, so 2 mana 2/3, which is solid, especially in a set like this where creatures have about your average curve, I would say. Whenever it becomes the target of a spell, you sack it, and then you can embalm it for 4 mana. So this is obviously your typical illusion downfall, where an illusion that becomes the target of a spell gets sacrificed. And that's a little bit annoying, especially if your opponent ends up playing cards that have multiple effects, or not multiple effects, but split effects where it can target multiple creatures. They can just target this with literally anything that normally wouldn't kill it, and it could die. But the illusion clause usually includes a part about being the target of an ability, and that is not included on Labyrinth Guardian. So normally an illusion could be targeted with something like Vizier of Tumbling Sands ability or something like that, and it would die, but this Labyrinth Guardian doesn't actually have that. It has to specifically be targeted by a spell, which means that if your opponent wanted to remove this, they probably have to cast a spell on it anyway, which means that it's not really that much of a downside. What this does stop you from doing is using your own auras on the Labyrinth Guardian, which I don't love that much. You can embalm this and bring it back, but by the time you embalm it, it's going to be a little bit on the weaker side. A 2/3 for 4, obviously not as impressive as a 2/3 for 2, but it is extra value out of the card. I just hate that the illusion has a way to get rid of it, where otherwise it might not be the best, or it might not be that hard to deal with. And then finally, Aven Initiate is a 4 mana 3/2 flyer with Embalm for 7. So obviously overcosted Embalm, but consider that a bonus rather than anything to say negative about the card. This is just a vanilla flyer, and a card that we see quite often and usually performs fairly well. The typical 3 power flyer for 4 mana is, in my opinion, pretty good and usually plays out pretty well. and blue just needs these flyers to get in damage, and this is your general flyer here. Just a common flyer that you can get for almost any deck, and if it happens to die and you go really late game, sometimes you get it back for 7 mana and you get your little zombie bird warrior. Alright, now moving into the cards that I'm actually excited about. Again, if you disagree that I'm valuing some of these cards a little bit too highly, or you think one of the other cards should be higher up, let me know. But we're going to start off by mentioning Open into Wonder, a card that I had pretty tough time deciding where to put it at. At one point I had it at 4, then I bumped it up, and then I decided 7 is probably where I want to start this card. It's an interesting effect. You're paying 2 blue and X to give X target creatures unblockable for the turn, and then whenever those creatures deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So a lot of things going on here. I think this is at its best in a blue X shell where you're using your X color, your reds or your greens, to really push in damage. And the reason this has to be a 7 for me is because you can actually use this to just win the game. If you're in blue-green and you have a bunch of huge creatures, making them all unblockable for the turn is a great way to just end the game, and your opponent can't really do too much about that once it happens. It doesn't matter if you're in a board stall or anything along those lines. You just win the game sometimes using this. Also, the draw card thing is pretty nice. Even if you're not in blue X shell or something like that, you're just mono blue, and you have a bunch of little creatures that can get in for the turn, then you draw a bunch of cards off of this, and I like it. Yes, it is sorcery speed. It's a little bit on the clunky side. It does require you to have a board in order for it to be good, which I think is stopping it from being an 8 or higher or anything along those lines. But I do think Games Unlimited will end because of this card, and I do think even when they don't end, it'll push you very, very far ahead. Assuming you're not under a lot of pressure, you can usually just tap out for this, draw a bunch of cards, and then be way ahead for your next turn. Cryptic Serpent is an interesting card too. It's 7 mana total, double blue and 5, for a 6/5 that costs 1 less to cast for each instant or sorcery in your graveyard. The reason I'm giving this such a high pick, even though it's essentially just a big vanilla creature, is that I see you being able to cast this for 5 or less mana pretty often. If you ever cast this for 6, it's okay, and I think that's pretty reasonable. If you ever cast this for 5 or less, it's just above the curve, and it should be able to be relevant, even though it may drop off when your green decks start casting their 7/7s and 6/6s and things along those lines. But if you can get this down a turn or two earlier than that starts happening, it should be able to get some real damage in. Keep in mind that one of the easiest ways you're going to get instants and sorceries in your graveyard is going to be through Cyclone, which you're going to do in the early game pretty often, making this guy a little bit cheaper. It's not very likely you'll get this down for by turn 3 or 4, but I think it is possible. And if you ever get to the point where you're paying just double blue, that's the dream. And it doesn't really matter when you're casting this, as long as you're paying double blue for it. It's just an insane creature as is. Pull from Tomorrow, a very interesting draw spell. Instant speed, you pay X and double blue to draw X cards, and then you discard 1 card. Keep in mind that you discard 1 card no matter how many cards you're drawing, so this scales up in power quite a bit the more you're able to pay X for. If you start with X equals 1, this turns into a pretty embarrassing card where it's just 3 mana, draw a card, discard a card. If you're paying 2, then you've got another draw 2, discard 1, which is okay at instant speed, but not something that deserves a rare spot. Where I really like this card is when you're paying 3 or more for it. And there are going to be some games where you can dump a ton of mana into this and discard only 1 card and be way up in value. Hopefully to the point where you can pull out a win from whatever you drew. Keep in mind, if you pay 4 for this, you're actually just casting Opportunity. 6 mana to draw 4 cards. Even if you have to discard 1, is super good. And if you ever pay more than 4 for X, the card is just insanely valuable. So I like this card quite a bit. It's not something I'd want to start my draft off with, unless I know for a fact that blue is just a very good color, which I won't know until I play the format. But right now, I'm giving it a thumbs up. I think it's a really strong draw spell. And then finally, Lay Claim. Probably winner of the most awkward art in this entire set. Very interesting card because of how expensive it is. It's 7 mana Mind Control. You enchant a permanent and you control that permanent. A couple things to say about this. First off, there are not a lot of ways to deal with enchantments in this set, so when you stick this, it's very likely going to stick permanently during the course of most games. It is super expensive. I know a lot of people, whenever we see mind controls, that we think they're very strong because they are 2-for-1s. And yes, Lay Claim is a 2-for-1. Your opponent loses something, you gain something at the same time. Probably the best creature on board for most during most games, and I think that's a very good effect to have, but 7 mana is a lot for that effect. So if this is your big game ender, you need to make sure you're getting something from your opponent that's actually going to end the game. Otherwise, this doesn't really do that much. It can take any permanent too, so keep in mind if there's a problematic enchantment on board or something along those lines, then this can functionally take care of that. And it also cycles for 2 mana, which we beat the dead horse about cycling. Is pretty good. Also really interesting that if your opponent plays this on one of your cards, you can play your Lay Claim on their Lay Claim and take control of their Lay Claim. Anyway, that's not going to come off very often. Moving on. So this is starting to get to the cards that I think are just Blue's best cards. You'll see a lot of rares here, you'll see some mythics, and you'll see a lot of uncommons. So whenever an uncommon pops up in the 8 spot, that means I believe it's one of Blue's best uncommons. The first card, which isn't an uncommon, is actually rare, is Drakehaven, which is 3 mana for an enchantment that says whenever you cycle or discard, you can pay a mana, and if you do, you create a 2/2 blue Drake. This is the type of card you take very early in a pack, you build around it, you take as many cyclers as you can, and you win the game because 2/2 Drakes get out of hand very quickly. This doesn't even require you to really play off curve, because a lot of times you'll be cycling your cards for the Drake. If a 2/2 flying creature is just better than the card in your hand that you're cycling, then you're going to cycle almost every time. And cycling costs in Blue are cheap enough that you should have that 1 mana open to be able to draw this. This also, or activate this, not draw this. It's also worth mentioning that this triggers whenever you discard any card, not just from cycling. So if you have a loot type effect or anything at all that your opponent makes you discard, you can trigger this ability and get a 2/2 Drake. And I imagine that a lot of games you should be able to swarm the battlefield with these Drakes to the point where you can push it into a win. So I like Drakehaven quite a bit as a build around enchantment that I would be happy to first pick. Angler Drake is a tried and true creature, at least as far as the ability is concerned. You're paying 6 mana, which is a lot for a 4/4 flyer, which is also very good. And when it enters battlefield, you may return target creature to its owner's hand. So your big flying mana war. We see this card a lot, and I still just have never really seen it be bad in a game of Limited. Mist Raven especially is a prime example of this, having just come off the back of Modern Masters 2017. This is just a big Mist Raven. Instead of a 4 mana 2/2, you're getting a 6 mana 4/4, which it could be your finisher as well. I like this. It's a 2-for-1. It's uncommon. It doesn't cost too much. It's evenly costed for the power and toughness you're getting out of it, and it can just help you finish up a game while also setting your opponent back. And then finally, our Blue God, Kefnet, card that I'm not really that excited by because I do think having 7 cards or more in your hand is asking a lot in Limited, but it does give you a game plan, right? For those of you who may not know, Kefnet is 3 mana for a 5/5 flyer, indestructible, and it can only attack or block if you have 7 or more cards in hand, which is a lot in Limited. Think of just in general how many times you draft and how many times you actually sit around with 7 or more cards in hand. It's not very often. And then Kefnet does have an activated ability, which gives me the bump up here that I think Kefnet deserves. 4 mana to draw a card, and you may return a land you control to its owner's hand. That land part, probably not going to come up too often, but it is a way to put extra cards in your hand and make sure Kefnet can attack. Now, I think Kefnet does deserve a really high spot. I think that downfall is quite a bit, having 7 or more cards in hand, but it does give you a plan of action. You can actually just choose to hold cards in your hand, and if your opponent can't deal with a 5/5 flyer, well, you just get to win the game over the course of a couple turns, hopefully before your opponent can win. Not to mention, if you do fall below 7 cards, the activated ability really helps you get back up there too. Kefnet Baby, even stronger than I'm giving him credit for, but I'm just weary of the fact that sometimes you'll play this, you'll have no cards in hand, and Kefnet really won't do that much, even though it is a nice little mana sink with its ability as well. And it is a very threatening flyer if you ever get it online. So maybe a 9, but I have to play with the card before I really say that this is a bomb rare. Mythic rare, for that matter. Moving into the cards that I think are bombs, the first one is Glyph Keeper. This is 5 mana for a 5/3 flyer that basically counters the first spell or ability that targets it each turn, and then you can embalm this for 7. This is a huge flyer. It does have 3 toughness, which is very vulnerable to other flyers in this set. There are a lot of 3 power flyers when it comes to the actual flying creatures in this set. So there are sometimes you play this and your opponent brick walls it with one of their flyers, but assuming your opponent's in a non-blue, non-white deck, maybe they're red-green or something like that, they're not going to have a lot of ways to deal with this, and they have to target it essentially twice in order to kill it at all, meaning they're probably wasting multiple resources to get rid of this. And then if they do manage to get rid of it, which is not an easy task, you get to just bring it back with Embalm later in the game, and then where you have to analyze the situation where your opponent can't get rid of this, your opponent doesn't have 2 spells or abilities to target this, and then boom, you just win the game. Just like Kefnet. 5 power flyer is a lot of flying power. We see this a lot in blue when it comes to limited sets. They have kind of janky, dirtily type creatures on the ground, and then they have these huge rare flyers. So this is not a card that I would be happy to play against, and it is a card that I would be super stoked to first pick because I know it has built-in protection, even though there are ways around that, and it does have late game inevitability too when it comes to Embalm. Along the similar lines here is Curator of Mysteries. Interested to see which of these guys you think is actually better. I think Curator of Mysteries is even better than Glyph Keeper. It's 4 mana for a 4/4 flying, so 1 less power, 1 more toughness, 1 less mana, which is pretty important. And 4/4 flyer for 4 is already just a very powerful card. Whenever you cycle or discard another card, you scry 1, and you can cycle for blue mana. Let's be honest, I said this when I was looking at the spoiler for this card. You're never cycling this card in a game of Limited. If you do, things have gone awry. If your 4/4 flying is better off served as a card that you would rather discard and try to find something else, you're probably not winning a game, right? But this is just a huge creature when it comes to flying power in the board. If your opponent doesn't have Kefnet or their own Curator of Mysteries, they're not going to be able to deal with this when it comes down on curve. And then it also has upside too, which to me is just ridiculous. A 4 power flyer for 4 mana with upside seems crazy. And keep in mind, whenever you cycle a card and that scry trigger happens, you actually get to scry before you draw the card from cycling. So you can stack the trigger to know what card you're going to draw, and if you don't want to draw that card, scry it to the bottom and draw a new card. So Curator helps you dig even deeper with your cycling cards, or if you happen to be discarding, just like any other card that says that. This is just a very good card. I do think it's a little bit stronger than Glyph Keeper because it does have a little bit of upside, even though Glyph Keeper has the built-in protection clause, which I think is relevant too. And then finally, I wanted to mention Vizier of Many Faces. 4 mana for a 0/0 shapeshifter. When it enters the battlefield, or as it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature, and it becomes a copy of that creature. And then if it dies, you can embalm it from the graveyard for 5 mana, and you get to choose a new creature to have it enter as a copy of. So you have a glorified clone here that comes back and clones something different when you embalm it, which is a great card. Clones are normally really strong in Limited, especially for blue. They give blue the option to just have the biggest creature on board. The wonderful thing about clones is once you play one and it sticks on the board, you very, very likely just have the best creature on board, if not tied for the best creature. So they're good at stabilizing the board by making sure that you're at least at parity with your opponent, and sometimes they just push you way ahead by copying some bomb creature. This can copy your opponent's creatures or your own creatures, so if you happen to have, I don't know, a giant flying sphinx, you can have this enter the battlefield as a copy of it. Your opponent very likely isn't going to be able to ignore it and has to kill it, and then if they do, you have the embalm option to bring it back. These big blue bombs with Embalm are really, really good because they give you a second crack at having your bomb. If your opponent doesn't exile them, your opponent has to have a plan for dealing with them twice, which is asking quite a bit when they come down as 5/3 flyers and 4/4 flyers and giant creatures off of Vizier and things along those natures. So Vizier of Many Faces, really strong card. I would definitely first pick it almost every single time, and I'd be very happy to play it in every single blue deck. And then we have to talk about our 10. Ancient Crab, the most insane card ever printed. Don't pass it. Take it. First pick every single time. Hopefully it's foil. It's worth tons of money. Just kidding. Ancient Crab sucks. Don't play this card. Actually, Ancient Crab's probably fine in this set, especially if you want to be blocking. Anyway, he's a 10 out of 10. Take him every time. He's great. Alright, So with that being said, that's going to take care of our blue cards for Amonkhet. Keep in mind, if you didn't see any splits or aftermath cards here, that's because I'm saving them for a separate video, which will be included with the gold cards or the multicolor cards from this set. So with that being said, thank you guys for watching. I would love to hear what you guys are thinking about some of these cards, whether you agree or disagree with some of my evaluations. And if you think this has been helpful for you, please let me know by giving me a thumbs up or a comment or something along those lines, just so I know that this is worthwhile to somebody. And with that being said, we'll look at the black cards next time. And after that, it's probably red and then green and then multicolor and then the rest of the set, right? Anyway, thanks for watching. My name's Timothy, and I will see y'all next time.